He hadn't moved in 72 hours, not even when the rain came sideways off the southern wind and soaked the cemetery down to its bones, not even when strangers tried to pull him away with gentle hands and soft voices that meant nothing to him, because the only voice he knew, the only one that mattered, was already silent beneath polished timber and white lilies, and somehow, in a way no one there could explain, the dog understood that silence better than anyone else standing on that damp patch of earth just outside a small coastal town in New South Wales, where the air carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus, and grief settled like morning fog that refused to lift. Before we begin, just take a second and tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this travel far, and sometimes they find the people who need them most. And if you believe no soul should ever stand alone at the edge of goodbye, stay with me, because this one doesn't begin with answers, it begins with a question no one at that funeral could answer. Not the priest, not the neighbors, not even the man standing at a distance with his arms folded tight across his chest, as if holding himself together by force. The dog lay there, a German shepherd with a coat darkened by rain and time, his ribs faint beneath the fur, his eyes fixed not on the people, not on the sky, but on the coffin itself, as though something inside it was still calling him, still asking him to stay. And every now and then his ears would twitch at a sound no one else could hear, something small and distant, like a memory echoing through wood and soil. They had tried everything, offering water, food, even a blanket, but he refused it all, his body anchored to that spot with a kind of quiet determination that didn't look like stubbornness so much as purpose. And that was what unsettled people the most, because this wasn't just a dog grieving, this was a dog waiting. And no one knew what for. The girl's name had been Lily Harper, 9 years old, the kind of child who waved at strangers and talked to animals as if they understood every word, which, if you asked the dog, they probably did, and the story people told each other in hushed voices was simple enough, that she had found him months ago near the edge of the bushland just beyond town, thin and skittish and carrying the kind of silence that only comes from being forgotten, and she had brought him home, given him a name, Rex, and somehow, without training or command, he had decided she was his entire world. But what people didn't talk about, not out loud at least, was how closely he stayed to her after that, how he watched doors, windows, shadows, how he seemed to listen not just to footsteps but to the spaces between them, as if the world held something fragile he alone could sense. By the third day, the crowd had thinned, the flowers beginning to wilt at the edges, petals curling inward like tired hands, and the sky had turned that pale washed-out blue that comes after too much rain, when everything feels quieter than it should. And that was when the motorbikes rolled in, low and steady along the gravel road, a small group of riders passing through on their way further inland, their engines cutting through the stillness in a way that felt almost out of place among headstones and silence. And yet they slowed, one by one, helmets tilting as they took in the sight of the dog who did not move, who did not even glance their way, because whatever held him there was stronger than noise, stronger than curiosity, stronger even than the instinct to survive. One of the riders, a tall bloke with sun-creased skin and a jacket worn soft at the seams, cut his engine completely and let the quiet return, and for a long moment he just stood there, watching, not with pity, but with the kind of attention that comes from recognizing something you can't quite explain yet somehow understand. And then, almost without thinking, he took a step closer, boots crunching lightly over damp gravel. And that was the first time the dog reacted, not with a bark, not with fear, but with a low, steady sound that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside his chest. A warning, yes, but not the kind meant to push people away, more like the kind that says you're standing too close to something important, something not finished yet. And the rider paused, eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the dog's gaze down to the base of the coffin, to a place where the earth looked just a little different, just disturbed enough to suggest that whatever this dog was guarding, it wasn't only grief. The biker did not step back, not fully, but he shifted his weight the way someone does when they realize the ground beneath a moment is not as simple as it first seemed. And the others behind him, 3 in total, removed their helmets one by one, the quiet click of buckles and the soft thud of boots against damp gravel folding into the hush of the cemetery. And none of them spoke at first, because there was something about the way the dog held that space that made words feel intrusive, like stepping into a room where a conversation had not finished yet. The man closest, his name was Callum Reed, though no one there knew it yet, had spent most of his life reading small things, tire tracks on red dirt, changes in wind across open paddocks, the kind of instincts that come from years on the road where details keep you safe. And what he saw now was not just grief, it was intention. The way the dog's body angled slightly toward the lower edge of the coffin, the way his paw rested just near a patch of soil that looked darker than the rest, not freshly turned, but not settled either, as if something had disturbed it recently and then been pressed back into place without care for how it might appear to a careful eye. Callum crouched slowly, not wanting to trigger another warning, his movements deliberate, almost respectful, and the dog's gaze flicked to him again, that low sound returning, steady, not rising, not falling. A boundary drawn without aggression, and Callum nodded, faintly, as if acknowledging it, as if the dog had spoken in a language he understood well enough to answer without words. And then he looked up at the others, a brief glance that said, "Stay where you are. This is not something to rush." Behind them, the last of the mourners had drifted further back, some watching with quiet curiosity, others turning away because whatever this was, it felt too close to something they could not name. And the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant ocean, the kind of smell that usually meant calm, but here it seemed to hold a question in it. Callum reached out, not to the dog, but to the ground, stopping short just before his fingers touched the soil, giving the dog one more chance to object. And for a moment nothing happened, just the sound of breath, his and the dog's, the slow rhythm of two beings sharing the same thin slice of time. And then the dog shifted, not away, but slightly aside, just enough to reveal more of that patch of earth, his head lowering, but his eyes never leaving Callum's face. And that was when something in Callum's chest tightened, because animals do not move like that unless they are choosing to let you see. He brushed the surface lightly, the soil cool and slightly compacted, but there was a difference in texture, a faint resistance that did not match the rest of the ground. And when he pressed a little more firmly, his fingers caught on something beneath, not hard like stone, not brittle like roots, but smooth, deliberate, and he paused again, glancing at the dog, who did not growl this time, did not warn, only watched with a stillness that felt heavier than before, as if this was the moment that mattered. Carefully, Callum cleared a small space, just enough to reveal the edge of a narrow wooden box, no larger than 30 centimeters across, tucked beneath the lip of the coffin as though it had been placed there in haste or secrecy. And the sight of it drew a quiet breath from one of the other riders, a woman named Tessa who stepped forward despite herself, her voice barely above a whisper when she said, "That should not be there." And she was right. Everyone there knew it without needing to explain why. Because funerals follow a kind of order, a structure people cling to when everything else falls apart. And this did not belong to that structure. Callum did not remove the box immediately. He simply exposed more of it, enough to see that it had been wrapped once in something thin, perhaps cloth, now damp and clinging, and tied with a simple cord that had loosened in the wet. And as he worked, the dog lowered himself further to the ground, his body no longer tense but not relaxed either, something in between, like a guard at the end of a long watch who knows his task is almost complete. The priest, who had remained at a distance, now approached slowly, uncertainty in his steps, asking in a quiet voice what is going on here. But Callum did not answer right away, because answers felt premature, like speaking before a story had revealed its shape. And instead he gently lifted the box free from the soil, holding it in both hands, feeling its weight, light but not empty. And for a second the world seemed to narrow to that small object and the dog beside it, whose breathing had changed, slower now, deeper, as if something inside him had finally begun to settle. There was no rush, no sudden movement, only a careful untying of the cord, fingers steady despite the chill. And when the lid shifted slightly under his touch, a faint scent escaped, not decay, not anything harsh, but something softer, like paper and old wood. And inside, just visible in the dim light, lay a small collection of things placed with intention, a folded note, a worn ribbon, and a collar, too small for a grown dog, the leather aged but cared for, and Callum stopped, his hand hovering above them. Because whatever this was, it was not random, it was a message, and the dog, who had not taken his eyes off the box, finally lowered his head to the ground, resting it there with a quiet exhale that carried more weight than any sound he had made before, as if the reason he had stayed, through rain and hunger and the long stretch of hours, had just been brought into the light. Callum did not open the note straight away, not because he was unsure, but because something about the moment demanded a kind of patience that could not be rushed, the kind that comes when you realize you are standing at the edge of someone else's last intention, and the wind shifted again, brushing lightly across the cemetery, as if the world itself was leaning in to listen, and the others drew closer without being told, their presence quiet, respectful, forming a small circle around the man, the box, and the dog who had finally allowed his body to rest against the ground, his chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths, no longer guarding, no longer warning, just staying, as though whatever he had been holding onto had now been passed on. Tessa knelt beside Callum, her voice soft, almost careful not to disturb something unseen, asking if he was going to read it, and he nodded. But even then he took a moment, brushing away a trace of damp soil from the folded paper before lifting it free, the edges worn but intact, the crease deep as though it had been folded with intention more than once. And when he opened it, the faint smell of pencil and old paper rose into the cool air, a small, human detail that made everything feel suddenly closer, more real, and the handwriting inside was uneven, childlike, each letter pressed with care, as if the act of writing had mattered just as much as the words themselves. He read it silently at first, his eyes moving slowly across the lines, and something in his expression shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough that the others noticed, enough that Tessa leaned in just slightly, waiting, and then he spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear, his voice carrying that steady, grounded tone that made each word land with weight, saying that Lily had written this for Rex, that she had known she might not get better, that she had asked her father to place the box beneath her coffin so Rex would find it, because she believed he would come, because she said he always knew where she was even when no one else did. And the words settled into the air like soft rain, each one soaking into the quiet around them. Callum paused, glancing briefly at the dog, who remained still, but whose ears twitched at the sound of her name. And then he continued, reading the part that said she did not want Rex to be alone, that she knew he would wait, and she did not want him to wait forever. That inside the box was the first collar she had given him, the one from the day they met, and a ribbon from her hair, so he would remember home, and that if someone kind found it, they should take him somewhere safe, somewhere with space and sun, and people who would understand. That he was not just a dog, he was someone who had loved her properly. The priest lowered his gaze, his hands folded tighter than before, and one of the riders let out a slow breath he had been holding without realizing it. Because there was something about hearing a child's words carried through another person's voice that made the distance between past and present disappear, and Callum's voice softened slightly as he read the last line. The one that said, "Thank you for staying with me when I was scared," and it was simple, nothing ornate, nothing dramatic, just a quiet expression of something most people spend their lives trying to say properly. When he finished, he did not speak again for a moment. He simply folded the note back along its original crease and placed it gently on top of the collar inside the box, his movements careful, deliberate, as though he understood that even now, after everything, this was still not his story to handle roughly. Beside him, Rex shifted, not abruptly, not in alarm, but slowly, as if waking from a long, necessary stillness, and he lifted his head just enough to look at the box, then at Callum, and for the first time since anyone had seen him there, his eyes softened, not losing their depth, but releasing something that had been held tightly behind them, and Callum, without thinking, extended his hand, not forcing contact, just offering it, palm open, steady. And the dog regarded it for a brief second before leaning forward, pressing his nose lightly against the man's fingers, a gesture so small it could have been missed, but in that moment it carried the weight of 72 hours of waiting. The others did not move, did not interrupt, because something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the air after a storm when the pressure finally lifts, and the dog rose to his feet, not with urgency, not with confusion, but with a quiet certainty that felt different from before, and he stepped away from the coffin. Just one pace at first, then another, turning once to look back, not as a guard now, but as someone acknowledging an ending, and the wind moved again through the trees, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and something else, something softer, like the echo of a promise that had been kept exactly as it was meant to be. No one told the dog it was time to leave, and yet he understood it in a way that did not need words, because something inside him had shifted from holding on to letting go. And that kind of change does not come from instruction, it comes from completion, from the quiet moment when a promise has been carried as far as it can go and no further. And Callum felt it too, standing there with the small wooden box still in his hands, the damp air brushing against his skin as though the world itself had exhaled. The priest stepped forward then, not to interrupt but to stand closer, his voice low and steady as he spoke to no one in particular, saying that sometimes love does not end when a life does. Sometimes it lingers in the small things left behind, in the choices made quietly, in the ways we wait for one another even when we do not fully understand why. And no one answered him, not because they disagreed, but because the truth of it had already settled among them, carried not by his words, but by the sight of a dog who had stayed longer than anyone thought possible. Tessa reached out slowly, her hand hovering just above Rex's shoulder before resting there lightly, testing the space. And this time the dog did not pull away, did not tense, he simply allowed it, his body still but no longer rigid, and she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her fingers brushing gently through the damp fur, as if confirming that this was real, that the moment had truly shifted. Callum closed the box carefully, tying the cord again not to seal it away, but to keep it together, to respect the way it had been given, and he glanced toward the coffin one last time, not with curiosity now, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if understanding that whatever had needed to be seen had already been revealed, and there was nothing more to take from that place. The others began to move in small ways. A step here, a glance exchanged, the subtle signs of people returning to themselves after standing inside something larger than they expected, and the distant hum of a passing car carried faintly from the road beyond the trees, a reminder that the world continued even when moments like this asked it to pause. Rex took another step back from the coffin, then another, his gaze lingering for a second longer before turning toward Callum, and there was something in that look that felt unmistakably like recognition, not of who the man was, but of what he had done, of the role he had played in completing something that had begun long before he arrived. And Callum met that gaze without hesitation, his posture steady, his expression softened by a respect he had not planned to feel when he first stepped off his bike that morning. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to the dog's level, not reaching this time, not offering his hand immediately, just allowing the space to exist between them, and Rex closed that distance on his own, stepping forward until he stood close enough that the warmth of his body could be felt even in the cool air. And when Callum finally did lift his hand, it was slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that asks rather than takes, and the dog leaned into it, just enough to rest his head briefly against Callum's wrist, a quiet gesture, but one that carried a kind of trust that could not be given lightly. Behind them, the priest spoke again, this time more gently, suggesting that it might be time to finish the burial. And the words did not feel like an ending so much as a continuation, a step that had been waiting for this moment to arrive, and the small group shifted aside, giving space as the final part of the ceremony resumed, the sound of soil falling softly against the coffin lid, measured, respectful, each handful marking not just an ending, but the closing of something that had already been honored in a way no formal ritual could fully capture. Rex did not return to the edge, did not try to move closer again. He simply stood where he was, watching, his body calm, his breathing steady, and when the last of the soil settled and the flowers were placed atop the fresh mound, he turned away without hesitation, as if he understood that his place was no longer there, that what had needed to be guarded had already been entrusted to hands that would carry it forward. Callum stood slowly, the small wooden box now tucked carefully beneath his arm, not hidden, not displayed, just held, and he looked toward the others, meeting each of their eyes in turn, a silent question passing between them that did not need to be spoken aloud, because they all understood what it was asking. What happens next? Tessa answered it first, her voice quiet but certain as she said, they could not leave him there, not after everything, not after what they had just seen, and no one argued, not even the priest, who simply nodded once, his expression carrying a kind of approval that felt less like permission and more like recognition, as if this too was part of the same story unfolding. The bikes waited at the edge of the cemetery, their metal frames still damp from the earlier rain, and as they walked toward them, Rex moved alongside Callum without being called, without needing direction, his steps measured, his presence steady, and when they reached the gravel, he paused briefly, looking back once more toward the place he had just left, not with hesitation, not with longing, but with something quieter, something that felt like understanding. And then he turned again, falling into step beside the man who had opened the box, who had read the words, who had listened when it mattered most. And in that simple act, something new began, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet continuation of a promise that had not ended, only changed shape. The road out of the cemetery curved gently through low gum trees, their pale trunks catching the late afternoon light in thin streaks. And the air had that quiet clarity that follows rain, clean but heavy with something unspoken. And as the group reached their bikes, no one rushed to start the engines, as if breaking the silence too quickly might undo what had just settled between them. Callum stood beside his bike, the small wooden box still tucked securely beneath his arm, and he glanced down at Rex, who stood close without crowding, his posture relaxed now in a way that had not been possible just hours earlier, and there was a steadiness in him that felt different, not empty, not lost, but reoriented, like a compass that had finally found its direction again after spinning for too long. Tessa swung her helmet lightly in one hand, watching the dog with a softness that had replaced the earlier curiosity, and she said quietly that he had chosen, not just to leave, but to follow, and Callum nodded once, not because it needed confirming, but because some truths are easier to carry when shared aloud, even softly. One of the others, a younger rider named Ben, scratched the back of his neck and asked what they were actually going to do now, his voice careful, not dismissive, just uncertain in the way people are when something meaningful asks for action beyond the moment. And Callum looked out toward the open road for a second before answering, his gaze tracing the line where the bitumen stretched toward the horizon, saying they would take him somewhere safe first, somewhere quiet, then figure out the rest. Properly, not rushed, not guessed. Rex shifted slightly at the sound of voices, but he did not move away, his ears flicking as if he was listening not just to the tone, but to the intention behind the words. And when Callum opened one of the panniers on his bike and carefully placed the wooden box inside, securing it so it would not move, the dog watched with a focus that suggested he understood the importance of what was being carried, even if he could not name it. The engines started one by one, low and steady, not loud enough to shatter the calm, but enough to signal movement. And Callum mounted his bike last, glancing once more at Rex as if to check whether he would hesitate. But the dog did not. He stepped forward without prompting, positioning himself naturally beside the bike, not attempting to climb, not unsure, simply ready. And Callum reached down, giving a small, reassuring touch to the side of his neck before easing the bike forward slowly, allowing Rex to set the pace. At first, to find his footing in this new direction, they moved at a measured speed along the gravel, tires crunching softly, and when they reached the bitumen, Callum kept the pace low, around 30 kilometers per hour, mindful of the dog beside him, who matched the movement with surprising ease, his stride steady, his breathing controlled, as though he had walked alongside journeys like this before, not on roads, perhaps, but through moments that required endurance more than speed. The town lay a few kilometers ahead, small and quiet, the kind of place where people notice new arrivals but do not always ask questions straight away. And as they approached, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the roadside, turning everything a shade warmer, softer, and there was something about that light that made the transition feel less abrupt, as if the world itself was easing them from one chapter into the next. They pulled into a modest service station at the edge of town, the kind with a single row of pumps and a small shop that smelled faintly of coffee and dust, and when the engines cut off again, the silence returned. But it was different now. Not heavy, not waiting, just present. Rex slowed, then stopped beside Callum, looking up briefly before lowering his head, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement, and Callum crouched down again, this time more naturally, as if the space between them had already been bridged, and he spoke softly, not expecting the dog to understand the words, but knowing tone carries more than language, telling him they would sort it out, that he was not being left anywhere, not today, not after everything. Tessa returned from inside with a bowl of water and placed it on the ground, stepping back to give space. And for a moment Rex simply looked at it, as if unsure whether this was part of the old world or the new one. And then he stepped forward, lowering his head slowly, taking a few careful laps, not desperate, not rushed, just enough to accept what was being offered. And that small act, simple as it was, seemed to settle something in everyone watching, because it meant he was choosing to stay not just in presence, but in life. Ben leaned against his bike, arms folded loosely now, and said it was strange how a day that started as just another ride had turned into something none of them would forget, and Callum gave a faint, almost absent smile at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was true in a way that did not need elaboration. The sky above shifted toward evening, a soft gradient of gold and blue, and somewhere in the distance a magpie called, its song clear and familiar, grounding the moment back into the ordinary world. And yet nothing about it felt ordinary anymore, not after what they had witnessed, not after what had been entrusted to them. Callum stood, glancing toward the road again, then back at Rex, who had finished drinking and now stood quietly, waiting without tension, without urgency, just present. And in that stillness there was a kind of understanding that went beyond command or training, something closer to agreement, unspoken but clear. And as Callum reached for his helmet and prepared to move again, Rex stepped into position beside him without being asked, his body aligned not just with the bike, but with the direction ahead, and the road, stretching out beyond the small town, did not look uncertain anymore. It looked like something to be walked, one steady step at a time. They left the service station just as the last light began to soften into evening, the kind of Australian dusk that does not fall all at once, but stretches slowly across the sky, turning the edges of clouds into pale gold and then into something quieter, and the road ahead opened into long, gentle bends bordered by low scrub and scattered gum trees, their silhouettes darkening against the horizon as the temperature dropped by a few degrees and the air carried that familiar mix of dust and cooling earth. Callum kept the speed steady, not more than 50 kilometers per hour, mindful of Rex running alongside. And every few seconds he glanced down, not out of worry, but out of awareness, the same kind that had guided him through years of riding across country roads where attention was not a choice but a habit. And Rex matched the rhythm without strain, his stride even, his breathing measured, as if the movement itself was part of something he had already accepted. Behind them, the others followed at a respectful distance, engines low, no one overtaking, no one rushing, because whatever this was, it did not feel like a ride anymore. It felt like a passage, something that needed to unfold at its own pace. After about 10 kilometers, the road narrowed slightly and curved toward a stretch of open land where a small farmhouse sat back from the roadside, its tin roof catching the last of the light, and Callum slowed further, pulling off onto the gravel verge and bringing the bike to a gentle stop, the others following suit without question, because by now the unspoken understanding between them had settled into something steady. He removed his helmet and rested it on the seat, looking out across the paddock where the grass moved lightly in the evening breeze, and there was a quiet there that felt right, not empty, but open, the kind of place where something could begin without needing to force itself into shape. Rex slowed to a stop beside him, his body no longer carrying the tension of earlier, and he stood for a moment, looking out across the same stretch of land, his ears flicking at distant sounds, a bird calling, the faint rustle of leaves, the small details that mark a place as safe or not. And after a second he stepped forward, not wandering far, just enough to test the ground, to feel it under his paws, then turning back toward Callum as if to say this will do for now. Tessa approached slowly, her boots pressing softly into the gravel, and she said it looked like a good place to rest for a bit, not to stay forever, but to pause, to let everything settle properly before deciding anything further. And Callum agreed without hesitation, because rushing beyond this point would have felt like ignoring what had already been given. Ben leaned against his bike again, watching Rex with a kind of quiet curiosity that had replaced his earlier uncertainty, and he said he had never seen a dog move like that, not just following, but choosing, and Callum glanced at him briefly, then back at Rex, and said that some choices are not about where you are going, they are about who you are willing to walk beside. And Ben nodded, not fully understanding perhaps, but sensing the truth in it. The sky deepened further, the gold fading into a soft blue-gray, and the first hints of evening chill settled in, enough to make breath visible in faint traces if you looked closely, and Callum opened one of the side compartments on his bike, pulling out a small folded blanket and laying it down on a patch of dry grass just off the verge, not calling Rex over, not instructing, just placing it there as an option, and the dog watched, then after a moment walked over and lowered himself onto it, his body easing into the fabric with a quiet exhale that sounded almost like relief. For a while, no one spoke, the kind of silence that does not press but simply exists, filled with small sounds, the ticking of cooling engines, the distant hum of wind across open land, the steady breathing of a dog who had finally allowed himself to rest without needing to listen for what might come next. Callum sat down a short distance away, not too close, not too far, his posture relaxed but attentive, and his gaze moved briefly toward the horizon before returning to Rex, who had closed his eyes but not fully, still aware, still present, just no longer holding himself in that tight, watchful state that had defined him at the cemetery. Time passed in a way that felt both slow and unmeasured, minutes stretching without urgency, and as the first stars began to appear faintly overhead, small points of light emerging one by one, Tessa spoke again, her voice low, saying that wherever they went next, it should be somewhere he could stay properly, not just pass through. Somewhere with space, maybe a bit of land, somewhere he would not be asked to forget what he had just come from. Callum considered that for a moment, then nodded, saying he knew a place about 20 kilometers further on, an old property owned by a mate who owed him a favor and who understood that sometimes what is needed is not explanation but time, and the others agreed without hesitation, because by now the direction had already begun to take shape. Rex stirred slightly at the sound of voices, lifting his head and looking toward Callum, not with urgency, not with expectation, just with a quiet readiness, and Callum met that gaze, offering a small nod, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement, and when he stood and moved back toward the bike, Rex rose with him, stepping into place without needing to be called, his body aligned once more with the road ahead, and as the engines came back to life, low and steady against the deepening night, the group moved forward again, not as riders passing through, but as something quieter, something more deliberate, carrying with them a small wooden box, a letter written in careful hands, and a dog who no longer needed to guard, only to walk beside. The night settled in fully as they rode on, not sudden but complete, the sky stretching wide and dark above them with a scattering of stars that seemed closer out here than anywhere near the coast, and the road ahead narrowed into a single ribbon of pale gray under their headlights, the beam cutting through the quiet like a path drawn just for them, and the air had cooled further now, carrying that faint chill that seeps through fabric and settles into bone if you stand still long enough. But none of them were thinking about the cold, not really, because the rhythm of movement had taken over, steady, measured, purposeful. Callum led the way, his posture relaxed but alert, one hand steady on the throttle, the other resting easy, and every so often he glanced down to his left where Rex ran beside him, the dog's silhouette moving in and out of the edge of the headlight beam, his stride unwavering, as if the darkness itself did not trouble him, as if he had already walked through deeper shadows than this. Behind them, the others kept formation without needing to discuss it, spacing themselves naturally, their headlights forming a loose chain of light along the road. And there was something almost ceremonial in the way they moved, not in any formal sense, but in the quiet agreement that this journey mattered in a way none of them had expected when the day began. After another stretch, perhaps 15 kilometers, the road turned to a narrower track, gravel replacing bitumen with a soft crunch beneath the tires, and Callum slowed again, easing the bike forward as the path wound gently through a line of trees before opening into a wider clearing, and there, set back about 50 meters from the track, stood a weathered homestead, its veranda wide, its timber walls worn pale by years of sun and wind, and a single light glowed near the front door, steady and warm against the dark. Callum brought the bike to a stop just before the gate, cutting the engine and letting the quiet return, and one by one the others followed, the sound fading until only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects filled the air, and Rex slowed with them, coming to a stop beside Callum without hesitation, his breathing controlled, not labored, just present, and he stood for a moment, looking toward the house, his ears lifting slightly as if taking in the new space, measuring it in the way only animals can. Callum swung his leg off the bike and removed his helmet, setting it aside before stepping forward to the gate, which creaked softly as he pushed it open, and the sound carried across the yard just enough to stir movement near the house, a shadow shifting on the veranda, then the door opening with a quiet click, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of presence that comes from someone used to reading situations without rushing to speak. And he paused there for a moment, taking in the scene, the bikes, the people, and then his gaze settled on Rex. Callum raised a hand in greeting, his voice carrying across the space in a calm, familiar tone as he called out to the man, saying it had been a while, and that he hoped the offer he made a year ago still stood, and the man gave a small nod, stepping down from the veranda and walking toward them at an unhurried pace, his boots sounding softly against the packed earth, and as he approached, the light from the house fell across his face, revealing features weathered but steady, eyes that held a kind of quiet understanding even before a word was spoken. He stopped a few meters away, glancing briefly at Callum before returning his gaze to Rex, and for a second there was no conversation, just that shared look between man and animal, the kind that bypasses explanation. And then he spoke, his voice low and even, asking simply what happened, not demanding detail, just opening the space for it if it needed to be given. Callum did not rush the answer. He took a breath, then explained in measured words, not the whole story, not every detail, but enough. A funeral, a dog who stayed, a box left behind, a letter written by a child who knew more than she should have needed to. And as he spoke, the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged but attentive. And when Callum finished, there was a brief silence, not awkward, just thoughtful. And then the man nodded once, as if something had settled into place for him. He stepped closer then, slowly, giving Rex the space to react, and Rex watched him, not tense, not wary, just aware. And when the man stopped within reach, he did not extend his hand immediately. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to form on its own terms. And after a second, Rex stepped forward, closing the distance by a small measure, his head lifting slightly, and the man responded by lowering his hand, gently, not reaching, just offering it at a level that did not demand anything, and Rex leaned in just enough to brush against it, a quiet acknowledgement that carried no resistance. The man glanced back at Callum, then toward the house, and said there was space out here, more than enough, and that the dog could stay as long as he needed, no questions, no pressure, just time, and Callum nodded, a small release of tension visible in the set of his shoulders, not dramatic, just enough to show that this had been the next step he was hoping for. Tessa exhaled softly behind him, the sound almost lost in the night, and Ben shifted his weight, a faint smile touching his expression, not because anything was solved, but because something had been given a place to begin. Rex stood between them, no longer at the center of something unresolved, but at the start of something quieter, something steadier. And as the man turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the door open, the light spilling out across the yard like an invitation that did not need to be spoken, Rex followed, not immediately, not without a brief glance back at Callum, and Callum gave a small nod, the same quiet acknowledgement he had offered before, and then the dog turned and walked forward, crossing that short stretch of ground not as a guardian, not as something lost, but as something that had found where it needed to be, at least for now. The house did not feel unfamiliar to Rex, not in the way new places usually do, because there was something about the stillness inside that did not push against him, something open, something that did not demand he forget where he had been. And as he stepped onto the veranda, the timber boards creaked softly beneath his weight, the sound low and steady, grounding, and he paused there for a moment, not hesitant, just aware, his head lifting slightly as he drew in the scent of the place, old wood, faint traces of smoke, the quiet presence of someone who lived simply and without hurry. The man stepped inside first, leaving the door open, not as an instruction but as an invitation, and Rex followed after a brief glance back toward Callum, who remained near the gate, watching not with concern, but with the kind of attention that allows something to unfold without interference. And when Rex crossed the threshold, he did so without tension, his body low but not guarded, his movements measured, as if he understood that this was not a place to defend, but a place to learn. Inside, the room was warm, not overly lit, just enough to soften the edges of the space. A single lamp casting a steady glow across worn furniture and a small table near the wall, and the man moved quietly, setting a metal bowl down on the floor and filling it with water from a tap that ran briefly before settling into silence again. And he stepped back without a word, giving Rex the space to choose, and for a moment, the dog simply stood there, looking at the bowl, then at the man, then toward the open doorway where the night still waited just beyond, and then he lowered his head and drank, not hurriedly, not as if he had been denied, but steadily, accepting what was offered in a way that spoke of trust beginning to take shape. Outside, Callum remained still for a few seconds longer, watching the scene through the doorway, and there was something in his posture that had softened, not because everything was resolved, but because something important had been placed where it needed to be, and he turned slightly as Tessa approached, her steps quiet on the gravel, and she asked if this was where it ended for them, and Callum shook his head gently, saying it was not an ending, just a place to leave something in good hands, and she nodded, understanding that some journeys are not meant to be followed all the way through, only far enough to make sure they continue. Inside, Rex finished drinking and stepped back from the bowl, his eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in the details, the corners, the shadows, the small things that tell a story about a place. And the man watched him without intrusion, leaning lightly against the wall, his presence steady but unobtrusive, and after a moment he moved to a small cupboard, opening it to retrieve a folded piece of cloth, placing it gently on the floor near the far side of the room, not calling Rex over, not directing him, simply offering it as a place that might be his if he chose it. Rex stood where he was for a few seconds longer, then walked over, his steps unhurried, and lowered himself onto the cloth, his body easing into it with a quiet shift that seemed to carry more than just physical relief, something deeper, something that had not been possible until now. And as he settled, he let out a soft breath, not heavy, not strained, just present, and for the first time since anyone had seen him at the cemetery, his eyes closed fully, not in exhaustion alone, but in a kind of rest that comes when there is nothing left to guard. The man watched this without comment, then turned and stepped back outside, closing the door only halfway, leaving it ajar, and Callum met him there, their eyes meeting briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, and the man said simply that he would be all right here, not immediately, not perfectly, but properly, and Callum nodded, his hand resting briefly on the side of his bike before he spoke, saying that the box would stay with him for now, that it belonged somewhere it could be kept safe, and the man agreed without question, understanding that some things are carried, not because they are owned, but because they are entrusted. The others began to move again, small shifts of posture, helmets being lifted, engines soon to be started, and the night around them felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, just wide and open. And as Callum prepared to leave, he looked once more toward the doorway, where Rex lay inside, still, breathing evenly, no longer watching, no longer waiting, just being, and that was enough. He mounted his bike slowly, the engine coming to life beneath him with a low, familiar hum, and the others followed, their lights flickering on one by one, casting long beams across the clearing, and as they turned back toward the road, the house behind them remained quiet, the single light still glowing softly, and within it, a dog who had carried a promise farther than most ever could now rested, not because the story had ended, but because it had found its place to continue without needing to hold on any longer. The road carried them away from the house slowly, not because of distance, but because something in each of them resisted leaving too quickly, and the headlights stretched forward across the narrow track before widening again into open bitumen. The night settling deeper now, the stars clearer, sharper, like quiet witnesses above a land that had seen too many stories to count, and yet still made space for one more. Callum did not speak over the comms. None of them did, because the silence felt earned, and the hum of the engine beneath him became the only rhythm he needed, steady, grounding, familiar in a way that allowed his thoughts to drift without losing their place. And every now and then his mind returned to the image of Rex lying down inside that small room, finally still in a way that did not feel like waiting anymore. And there was a kind of peace in that image that did not demand explanation. After a few kilometers, the group slowed near a stretch where the road overlooked a shallow valley, the land dipping gently away into darkness, and Callum eased his bike to the side, bringing it to a stop, the others following instinctively, engines cutting off one by one until the night returned in full, unbroken. Except for the faint whisper of wind moving across dry grass. Tessa removed her helmet and stepped a few paces forward, her gaze lifting toward the sky before settling out across the valley. And she said quietly that it was strange how something so heavy could end so quietly, not with a crash or a moment of noise, but with a dog lying down and choosing to rest. And Callum joined her, standing just to her side, his arms relaxed, his eyes following the same line out into the dark, and he replied, that some endings are not meant to be loud. They are meant to be understood, and sometimes that understanding only comes when nothing else is left to hold on to. Ben stayed near the bikes, leaning slightly against the seat, his expression thoughtful in a way that had not been there earlier, and he said he kept thinking about the letter, about how the girl had known, not just that the dog would come, but that someone else would too, someone who would open the box, someone who would read the words. And Callum nodded once, saying that faith does not always look like belief. Sometimes it looks like preparation, like leaving something behind in the right place at the right time, trusting that it will be found when it needs to be. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant water, and for a moment none of them spoke, the kind of pause that does not feel empty but full, as if the space itself was part of the conversation. Callum reached into the pannier and removed the small wooden box, holding it carefully in both hands, not opening it, just feeling its weight. And there was something about it now that felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just settled, like an object that had completed its first purpose and was waiting quietly for whatever came next. And he looked down at it for a moment before speaking again, saying that he would keep it for a while, not as a possession, but as something to look after, until it found where it needed to be. And no one questioned that, because some things are not assigned. They are simply carried by the person who happened to be there when they were revealed. Tessa glanced at him, then at the box, and said softly that maybe it had already found where it needed to be, not in a place, but in a person who understood why it mattered. And Callum did not respond immediately, but there was a slight shift in his expression, something that suggested he had heard more than just the words. The stars above seemed brighter now, the sky stretching wide and clear, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called, its sound echoing faintly across the valley before fading into the quiet again. And Ben pushed himself upright, exhaling slowly as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. And he said that he did not think he would forget this day, not the ride, not the dog, not the way everything had come together without anyone planning it. And Callum gave a faint nod, saying that some stories do not belong to the people who tell them. They belong to the moments that shape them. And all you can do is be there when they happen and not look away. They stood there for a while longer, no one keeping track of time, the kind of pause that feels longer than it is because it carries weight. And eventually Callum placed the box back into the pannier, securing it once more, not out of habit, but out of care, and he turned back toward his bike, the movement quiet but decisive, and the others followed, helmets lifted, engines starting again in low succession, the sound rising gently into the night. As they pulled back onto the road, the valley disappeared behind them, swallowed by darkness, but something of it remained, not in sight, but in the way each of them rode, a little slower, a little more aware, as if the road ahead had changed not in shape, but in meaning, and somewhere behind them, In a house set back from the track, a dog slept without needing to listen for footsteps, without needing to guard what could not be taken, and that absence of tension was not emptiness. It was something quieter, something closer to peace, the kind that does not announce itself, but simply stays once it arrives. The road stretched on through the night, long and quiet, the kind that does not rush you forward but lets you sit with whatever you are carrying, and Callum felt that more clearly now than he had earlier, not as a weight pressing down, but as something settled just beneath the surface, steady and present, like a memory that has found its place. The hum of the engine beneath him blended into the rhythm of his breathing, and the air grew cooler as they moved further inland, the scent shifting from coastal salt to dry earth and faint traces of eucalyptus carried on the wind. And every now and then he glanced toward the horizon, though there was little to see beyond the soft outline of trees and the narrow strip of road illuminated ahead. But it was not about seeing, it was about continuing, about allowing the movement itself to carry what words could not. After another stretch, perhaps 20 kilometers, the group slowed again, not because they needed to, but because the road began to curve more tightly, dipping slightly between low hills, and Callum eased the throttle, bringing the pace down naturally, the others following without hesitation. And there was something almost instinctive in the way they moved together now, no longer separate riders, but a small formation shaped by the shared weight of the day. Ben rode a little closer this time, his posture less rigid than before, and when they reached a straight section he pulled alongside briefly, his voice coming through the comms in a low, thoughtful tone as he said, he kept thinking about how the dog knew when to stop, not just at the coffin, but later, at the house, like there was a line only he could see. And Callum listened, his gaze steady on the road ahead, before replying that some bonds do not need explaining. They just run their course until they reach the point they were meant to. And maybe the dog had simply reached his. Ben did not respond immediately, but there was a shift in the way he rode after that, something quieter, more reflective, as if the idea had settled somewhere deeper than he expected. The kilometers passed without urgency, the night stretching around them in a way that made time feel less important. And eventually the lights of a small town appeared in the distance, faint at first, then clearer as they approached, a handful of street lamps casting soft pools of light along the main road, a few parked cars, the outline of closed shops, everything still and undisturbed at this hour. Callum guided them through slowly, not stopping, just passing through, the sound of their engines echoing lightly against the buildings before fading again as they reached the far side. And once they were clear of the town, he signaled for a brief stop, pulling into a small lookout area just beyond the last streetlight, where the land opened slightly and the sky felt wider again. They dismounted in silence, the air here cooler, carrying a faint hint of moisture from somewhere unseen, and Callum removed his helmet, running a hand briefly through his hair before reaching for the pannier, opening it and lifting out the wooden box once more, not because it needed checking, but because something about this place, this pause, felt like it asked for acknowledgement. Tessa stepped closer, her gaze moving from the box to Callum's face, and she asked softly if he had read the note again in his head, and he gave a slight nod, saying that some words do not leave once you hear them. They stay, not loud, not constant, just present, like they are waiting for you to understand them properly. Ben joined them, his expression calmer now, less uncertain, and he said it felt strange that something so small could hold so much, a piece of paper, a collar, a ribbon, and yet it had changed everything about the day. And Callum looked down at the box briefly, before replying that it is not the size of what is left behind, it is the intention, and when that is clear enough, it carries further than anything else. The wind moved gently across the lookout, brushing against them, lifting small traces of dust that caught the light for a second before settling again. And for a while they stood there, not speaking, just sharing the space, the quiet stretching without discomfort. And then Callum placed the box back into the pannier, securing it with the same care as before, not out of habit, but because it felt right to do so. He looked out across the dark land for one last moment, then turned back to the bike, his movements unhurried but certain, and as he put his helmet back on, there was a sense of completion that did not come from finishing something, but from understanding that what had happened did not need to be carried any further than it already was. that it had already found its place within each of them. The engine started again, low and steady, and they pulled back onto the road, the town lights fading behind them, the open stretch ahead returning, and as they rode on, the night did not feel empty. It felt full in a quiet way, as if the space itself held something gentle, something that did not need to be named. And somewhere far behind them, in a house with a single light still glowing, a dog slept without waiting, without listening, and in that simple, unguarded rest, there was a kind of grace that did not need to be explained, only recognized when it appeared. The road began to feel less like a destination and more like a thread, something that connected moments rather than separated them. And Callum rode with that quiet awareness settling deeper into him, not heavy, not demanding, just present in the way certain truths are once they have been seen clearly. And the night air moved steadily around him, cool against his jacket, carrying the faint scent of distant paddocks and dry grass that stretched beyond what the headlights could reach. Behind him, the others followed without needing direction, their spacing natural, their pace unforced, and there was a quiet cohesion between them now that had not been there at the start of the day, not because they had changed who they were, but because they had shared something that did not belong to any one of them alone. After another stretch of kilometers, the road straightened out again, long and uninterrupted, and Callum eased his speed slightly, not out of caution, but out of choice, letting the ride settle into something slower, something that allowed the moment to breathe. And Ben pulled alongside once more, his helmet turning slightly as if he wanted to speak, but was not entirely sure how to begin. And after a few seconds he said through the comms that he had been thinking about what the man at the house said, about the dog being all right, not immediately, not perfectly, but properly, and that he had never really thought about things that way before. Callum listened, his eyes steady on the road, then replied that most things worth holding on to do not fix themselves quickly. They just find a place where they can exist without being pushed, and sometimes that is enough to begin with. And Ben nodded, even though it could not be seen, the understanding settling in a way that did not need further explanation. The kilometers passed quietly after that, the road carrying them forward through open land that seemed endless in the dark, and eventually they reached a junction where the bitumen widened slightly, and a sign stood at the side pointing toward different towns, each direction marked by distances that felt both precise and irrelevant at the same time, because none of them were really riding toward a place anymore. They were simply continuing. Callum slowed and pulled over briefly, the others following, and they gathered near the sign without speaking, the engines ticking softly as they cooled, and Tessa glanced up at the directions before looking back at Callum, asking where he was heading from here, not in a practical sense, but in the way people ask when they understand that the answer is not just about geography. Callum considered the question for a moment, his gaze resting on the sign before shifting out into the dark beyond it. And he said he would head north for now. No fixed plan, just follow the road until it felt right to stop. And Tessa gave a small nod, as if that made sense in a way that did not need to be explained further. Ben stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders as if releasing the last of the tension he had been carrying. And he said he might head west. There was a maid out that way he had not seen in a while, and the idea of turning up unannounced suddenly felt less strange than it would have earlier in the day, and the others shared similar thoughts, each of them choosing a direction that felt less like a decision and more like a continuation of something already set in motion. Callum reached into the pannier once more, not to open the box, but to rest his hand on it briefly, a quiet gesture that carried more meaning than any words he could have said, and for a second he closed his eyes, not in reflection, not in prayer, just an acknowledgement of what had passed through his hands and into his life. And when he opened them again, there was a steadiness there that had not been present before. The wind moved gently around them, lifting the edges of their jackets, carrying with it the faint sound of distant movement, perhaps a vehicle far off, perhaps just the land itself settling into the night. And Tessa stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on Callum's shoulder, not as a farewell, but as a quiet recognition of what had been shared, and he nodded once in return, the gesture simple, unspoken, but complete. One by one they returned to their bikes, helmets lifted, engines starting in low succession, and the sound did not break the moment. It carried it forward, each rider turning toward their chosen direction, the headlights shifting as they aligned with different roads, different paths, and for a brief second they all remained still, engines running, as if marking the point where one shared journey became several individual ones again. Then, without signal, without countdown, they moved, each in their own direction, the lights separating gradually until they were no longer part of the same line, but individual points in the dark, and Callum rode north, the road opening ahead of him once more, the steady hum of the engine returning as the only constant, and behind him, somewhere far beyond the reach of his headlights, a house stood quiet under the same sky, its single light now dimmed, its doorway closed, and inside, a dog slept without needing to wake for every sound, without needing to listen for footsteps that would not come, and in that sleep there was no absence, no waiting, only a quiet continuation of something that had been carried faithfully until it could finally be set down, not lost, not forgotten, just placed where it no longer needed to be held. The road north stretched on without interruption, a long quiet line through land that seemed to breathe slowly under the weight of night, and Callum rode into it without urgency, the distance ahead no longer something to measure but something to move through, and the hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm beneath him, almost like a second heartbeat that carried him forward without needing direction beyond the next stretch of light. The air had grown colder now, enough that the edges of it pressed gently against his skin even through the jacket, and the scent of eucalyptus thickened as the road passed through denser patches of trees, their branches arching overhead in places, forming brief tunnels of shadow that opened again into wide clearings where the stars returned, sharp and endless. Time passed in a way that felt both slow and immediate, the kind of passage where minutes do not announce themselves. And eventually the faint glow of early morning began to touch the horizon, not bright, not sudden, just a gradual lifting of darkness into something softer. And Callum eased his speed without thinking, as if the shift in light asked for it, as if the day itself needed to be met with the same quiet respect that had carried him through the night. He pulled off the road at a small clearing just beyond a bend, the ground flat enough to stand on, and cut the engine, the silence returning in full, deeper now with the absence of night insects and the first subtle sounds of morning beginning to take their place, and he removed his helmet slowly, resting it on the seat before stepping a few paces away, his boots pressing lightly into the earth, still cool from the night. The horizon stretched out before him, pale blue beginning to push against the last traces of darkness, and for a moment he simply stood there, not thinking, not trying to understand anything further, just allowing the stillness to exist without needing to fill it. And in that space, something settled, not new, not surprising, just clear, like a reflection that had been there all along but only now came into focus. He thought of Rex, not in images of the cemetery, not in the tension of waiting, but in the quiet of that small room, the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the way his body had finally allowed itself to rest without holding on to something unfinished. And there was a kind of quiet relief in that thought, not because the story had ended, but because it had reached a place where it no longer needed to be carried in the same way. Callum walked back to the bike and opened the pannier, lifting out the wooden box once more, holding it in both hands as the light slowly grew around him. And he did not open it, not this time, because he did not need to read the words again to understand them. They had already settled somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere closer to instinct, and he stood there with it for a moment, feeling its weight, not as a burden, but as something entrusted, something that had found its way into his care not by choice, but by timing, by presence, by simply being there when it needed someone. The first rays of sunlight touched the edge of the land, soft and pale, spreading slowly across the ground, and the chill in the air began to lift slightly, replaced by a gentler warmth that did not rush but arrived steadily, and Callum closed the pannier again, placing the box back inside with the same care as before, not because it was fragile, but because it mattered, and he rested his hand there for a brief second before stepping back. A magpie called somewhere nearby, its song clear in the quiet morning, and Callum looked up, following the sound without needing to find its source. And there was something about that simple note, that familiar call, that grounded everything, brought it back from the abstract into something real, something lived, and he took a slow breath, filling his lungs with the cool air that now carried a hint of warmth, and exhaled just as slowly, not releasing anything, not letting go, just continuing. The road waited behind him, unchanged, stretching out in both directions, offering nothing more than distance and possibility. And he put his helmet back on, his movements unhurried, deliberate, the same way he had moved through every part of the last day, not rushing what did not need to be rushed, not forcing meaning where it would arrive on its own. The engine started again beneath him, low and steady, and he eased the bike back onto the road, the tires finding their place on the bitumen with a quiet certainty. And as he rode forward into the growing light, the night behind him did not feel distant. It felt integrated, part of the same path, part of the same movement that continued without needing to separate what had been from what was coming next, and somewhere far from where he now rode, in a house that had already begun to fill with morning light, a dog stirred from sleep, not with urgency, not with the need to listen, but with the simple awareness of a new day arriving. And in that moment, there was nothing left to guard, nothing left to wait for, only the quiet presence of something that had been carried faithfully until it could finally rest, not lost, not forgotten, but held in a way that no longer required holding on. Morning unfolded slowly across the land, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, the light spreading in soft layers over fields that had held the night without complaint, and in that same gentle way, the world seemed to carry forward everything that had passed without needing to explain it, without needing to resolve it into something simpler than it was. At the homestead, the first sounds of the day arrived not as noise, but as presence. The creak of timber as it warmed, the distant call of birds moving through the trees, the faint rustle of wind brushing through dry grass. And inside, where the light now slipped through the half-open doorway and stretched across the floor, Rex stirred, not abruptly, not with the alert tension that had once defined his waking moments, but slowly, as if rising from a place that had finally allowed him to rest without interruption. He lifted his head first, ears flicking once at the sounds of morning. Then he shifted his body, stretching slightly, before settling again for a brief second, his eyes half open, taking in the room not as something unfamiliar, but as something that had already begun to make sense to him. The cloth beneath him carried the warmth of his body from the night. The scent of the place now mingled with his own, and when he finally rose, he did so without hesitation, his movements steady, unhurried, as if the absence of urgency itself had become a new kind of understanding. The man stepped into the room shortly after, his presence quiet as before, not announcing itself, just arriving, and he paused near the doorway for a moment, watching Rex not with inspection but with recognition, as though he understood that whatever had needed to happen had already taken place, and now what remained was not to change anything, but simply to allow it to continue. He moved to the side, placing fresh water in the bowl again, and this time Rex did not pause to consider it. He stepped forward and drank, not out of need alone, but out of acceptance, and when he finished, he remained there for a moment, looking toward the open doorway where the light now reached further into the room, touching the floor in a way that felt almost like an invitation. Outside, the land stretched wide and quiet, the early sun casting long shadows that softened as it climbed, and Rex stepped out onto the veranda, the timber boards warm beneath his paws now, the air carrying the scent of morning that was different from the night before, lighter, clearer, and he stood there for a moment, not searching, not listening for something that might come, but simply being, his gaze moving across the paddock, the trees, the open space that did not ask anything of him. The man joined him a short distance away, leaning lightly against the post, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, and for a while neither of them moved, the silence between them not empty but full in a way that did not require filling. Somewhere in that stillness, a shift completed itself, not visible, not dramatic, just a quiet realignment of something that had been carried through the night and now found its place in the day. Far from the homestead, the road continued to stretch under the rising sun, and Callum rode along it with the same steady rhythm. The light now clear and open around him, the land revealing itself in detail that had been hidden by darkness hours before, and there was a sense of continuation in that movement, not of leaving something behind, but of carrying it forward, in a way that no longer required effort, He did not think of the story as finished, not in any final sense, because some things do not end. They settle. They find a quieter form, and in that form they remain, not demanding attention, not asking to be revisited, just existing as part of what shapes the way you move through what comes next. Back at the house, Rex stepped down from the veranda and onto the ground. The grass cooled beneath his paws, and he walked a few meters out, then paused, looking back once, not toward the room, not toward anything specific, but in a way that acknowledged what had been without needing to return to it. And then he turned again, moving forward into the open space, his pace steady, his posture relaxed, no longer defined by what he had guarded, but by where he now stood. The man watched him go only as far as the edge of the yard, then returned inside, leaving the door open, not as a gesture, but as a simple continuation of the same quiet understanding that had carried through the night, and the light moved further across the floor, filling the room without resistance. There were no final words, no moment that marked an ending in the way people often expect, only the soft unfolding